Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day. Welcome to the 78th Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg, who will be mindful as we begin this Moggcast that rather a lot has happened since we met for the 76th, as Henry Hill did the 77th. Let's just start with a very simple question. Now we know the Prime Minister is going and there will be a new Conservative Party leader and Prime Minister. What went wrong?
It's a very difficult and sad question. I think, first of all, the tone of British politics was deeply soured by the referendum result. And there has been a degree of bitterness and hostility in British politics and irreconcilability that is abnormal. And you saw that in the 2017-2019 Parliament, which was a terrible Parliament and a very aggressive one internally. And then you saw it continue even after Boris Johnson had won a majority of 80. I'd initially thought that it would go into the past, but it hadn't. There are still a lot of people who believe that we should never have left and that we should try and stay as close as possible to the EU, who personally blame Boris Johnson for what has happened. And you see that in the very ungracious comments by John Major, who wanted to break the completely normal constitutional convention that a Prime Minister remains in office until a successor is found. We've never had caretaker Prime Ministers in this country. We don't need them. The Constitution works perfectly well. And so you see the bitterness that comes from that. And then, yes, some mistakes were made. Not one of them individually of sufficient importance to remove a Prime Minister. But with that base of hostility of a number of members of Parliament who had never reconciled them to what had happened in 2016 and then in 2019, keen to get rid of him. So I think that's the context. I think the difficult thing for the Tory party is that though there were 148 who had no confidence in Boris Johnson, there are probably more than 148 who have no confidence in any other candidate.
A historian would say, looking back on the defenestration of Margaret Thatcher, Europe, poll tax, wet, you can reel off the reasons. Or would say, looking back at the ousting of Theresa May, her withdrawal agreement failed 3 times. With Boris Johnson, it is harder to put your finger on what has happened, other than, would this be fair, just maybe a feeling by too many of his colleagues that he campaigned brilliantly, but couldn't govern in an orderly way.
I think there is a certain febrility, if that's a word, within the modern political system. I remember 1980s politics quite well because my father was a political journalist and it was you knew my father very well. It was a major topic of family conversation. And I remember quite senior ministers coming to see us and explaining how they were going to get Margaret Thatcher out in 6 months' time. And this went on and on and on. And, you know, there were disloyal ministers then and they wanted to get rid of her. And eventually they did. What has happened this time is it's happened faster. And I think we look back at 1979 to 1990 and think that Margaret Thatcher was secure in post for 11 years. And of course she wasn't. There were constant efforts to remove her. There were groups rallying around other individual candidates who they wanted to see replaced. There was Michael Heseltine's resignation, doing it very publicly. Mm-hmm. But there were lots of plots going on. And what has happened this time is I think that people who wanted to get rid of Boris Johnson, some of whom wanted the job for themselves, have been successful rather faster than they were against Margaret Thatcher. And I think that is the norm of politics. So I'm not saying this to you in a sense of complaining, just noting that it is more febrile than it was.
And we're left with a situation in which, rather like Margaret Thatcher, I mean, not so much like Theresa May, Boris Johnson will go down as a 100% election winner. He fought one election, he won it by a very large margin. And intuitively, it seems unjust that he's not allowed to put his claim to the members in this election. And you could argue if the members want to return him, they should at least be given an opportunity to do so, don't you think?
Yes, as it happens, I do. I think it's very dangerous for the party to turf out an election winner. And I think a lot of MPs are finding that their correspondence, which was, why has the Prime Minister said this, that, and the next thing about Partygate or whatever, or did he have a cake or not, are now getting letters saying, we voted for him, you chucked him out. How is that democratic? So I think there's quite a lot of anger in the country and within the Conservative Party about the treatment of Boris Johnson, and that this is damaging to the party. It would be foolish to pretend otherwise.
You'd be very happy to see him stand again, and you'd support him were that possible?
It's not possible, but I'm unequivocally a supporter of the Prime Minister.
Is this why, according to the Daily Telegraph, I quote, saw this on the way in to the podcast yesterday. We have to remember the listeners are listening to this on Tuesday, but this is a Monday. Jacob Rees-Mogg is mulling a shock entry into the Conservative leadership race as a continuity Boris candidate, the Telegraph can disclose. One MP said he would be brilliant and probably the only person all the pro-Boris MPs could support. So is there anything to this?
Not a great deal. One or two people have rung me to say I should consider throwing my hat into the ring, but I think it's a very crowded field. And I think there is a problem with the timescale of the leadership election, that those who have been disloyal to the Prime Minister have had plenty of time to set up their campaigns. Those who have undermined the Prime Minister, sometimes by actually running, dare I say, a not very successful economic policy, have had 6 months or more when they have been cogitating, mulling, considering their next steps. Where people have been loyal to the Prime Minister, of course, haven't, because people who've been loyal to the Prime Minister wanted him to carry on and therefore weren't considering a leadership campaign. And I think there is a difficulty that the haste favours the disloyal rather than the loyal.
Just to pin this down, you haven't said that you're definitely not going to stand.
I think it's extremely unlikely.
OK, I won't get into the side issue of Johnny Rotten, as I remember him, of the Sex Pistols, backing your candidacy, which he has done, according to the Telegraph.
I was absolutely delighted by that. He did it on an interview with Piers Morgan, and I have a feeling he was pulling my leg. It seems very unlikely that I would be genuinely his first choice candidate, but I thought this was all good fun.
You're not a fan of the Sex Pistols, anarchy in the UK and all that?
I'm not in favour of anarchy, but I always admire successful businessmen. And they did very well. They were very popular. And somebody who can connect. Look, I know nothing about football, but I admire successful footballers being able to make millions from being able to kick a ball. I admire punk rock stars who are able to make a decent living out of selling their music.
Right. Let's get on to part of what you want to talk about, because you've already made two veiled or scarcely veiled references to the subject. I confess, there are so many leadership candidates in this field. I'm having to make up rhymes in my head to try to remember them all. So I have to ask you, therefore, is there something fishy about Rishi?
Well, I want to talk to you about the economy, because you said to me, I don't know whether I'm allowed to tell our listeners this, but a couple of months ago you said to me that the Moggcast was going to be very difficult if I always sat here and said government policy is X. Within those constraints, I think I made it pretty clear that I wasn't entirely in favour of the economic policy that we were running. And I'm afraid I think the economic policy, which has the Chancellor's fingerprints all over it, and the approach of the Treasury as an institution has been very damaging to the British economy and indeed to the Conservative Party's electoral chances. So what do I mean by that? Well, I thought the national insurance tax rise was completely the wrong thing to do. And I argued this at the time. I went as far as I could within the constraints of collective responsibility to indicating my opposition publicly. Why was it wrong? Because we'd promised not to. We had put in our manifesto we would not increase national insurance, and we did, for, in the context of £900 billion of government expenditure, a small amount of money, which, as I argued at the time, could be got from savings. You could easily find whatever it was, £12 billion, 1.5%, just under, of government expenditure from efficiency savings. That's what I'm trying to do now in terms of reducing the size of the civil service back to 2016 levels. So that was a mistake. The corporation tax rise was a really silly thing to do, not least because cutting corporation tax from 28% to 19% led to a near 50% increase in revenues, and corporation tax as a percentage of GDP going up by 50 basis points. It was a successful policy of George Osborne's. George Osborne did a dynamic assessment on corporation tax before cutting it. First time the Treasury had ever done a dynamic assessment in tax collection. Lower rates worked. And then Rishi pushed this thing where we should have an internationally binding minimum corporation tax. Well, I thought we wanted to be competitive now we'd left the European Union, not bound into multinational agreements that tied the hands of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Then you come to the windfall tax, which I may have to vote for this evening, as I'm still bound by collective responsibility, which discourages investment, is the wrong answer to the question when we haven't been doing things like shale gas that might help keep prices down. You can go on. The Treasury last week, in the brief interregnum between Rishi and Nadeem, decided to kibosh the Public Sector Fraud Authority. Why did Lord Agnew resign? Lord Agnew resigned because the Treasury wouldn't be serious about fraud. Why wouldn't it be serious about fraud? Because it's embarrassed about how it structured the bounce back loans. Now, actually, I will defend the structuring of those loans because I think the issue was urgency, but that you should now be as hot as mustard on getting money back from fraud, and the Treasury hasn't been serious about it. I think the approach of the Treasury has been damaging this government under Rishi's stewardship.
You've just said, I may have to vote for the windfall tax this evening as though you were compelled to by some sort of act of God. And some of the listeners would say, on the one hand, look, if he didn't like the policy, he should have resigned. And they might add, if he doesn't like the policy and hasn't resigned, he really ought to exercise a bit of collective discipline and not complain about it. And the problem with modern politicians is they're continually complaining about what each other in government do.
Yeah. My loyalty is to the Prime Minister, which is why I haven't resigned now or previously. It was quite funny over the national insurance rise because after the cabinet meeting to discuss it, I came into this building, 70 Whitehall, to have a discussion with Mark Spencer about something, and then realised I'd left my telephone behind. So I went back to pick up my telephone and left the building much later than anybody else. And somebody reported that I'd had to stay inside to be persuaded not to resign, which wasn't true at all. It was merely absent-mindedness with my telephone. But no, my loyalty was the Prime Minister. I have been bound by the constraints of collective responsibility and made as good a case as I can for what we've been doing until now, because we are in open season now. People are setting out their stalls to be leader, and we need to discuss their policy successes and failures, and we need to discuss how policy should change in future. And here, we've got to be really serious about dealing with inflation. We've got to look at quantitative easing, £875 billion. Is that the right amount? We have to look at what the Bank of England is doing. The Bank of England is independent, and that's fine. But the government gets blamed for inflation, which hits the least well-off most. We have to look at fiscal policy. We want fiscal policy that encourages economic growth, but is not pro-inflation. And that means looking at expenditure. It may mean looking particularly at capital expenditure, because that can squeeze the labour market in particular areas, which can be quite inflationary. So we need to look at what we're doing, what we're spending. We need tight fiscal control. We need pro-growth taxation. We need the supply side reforms, which I've been arguing for some time. Things like, which we were about to announce, I think, removing all the tariffs we were about to announce, just for clarity, on goods that we don't produce, to reduce the cost for consumers. So there's a lot to be discussed now, and I think all cabinet ministers must be free to discuss these things in a leadership campaign.
I want to ask you a question about tax policy in America, because there's an aspect of what's going on that fascinates me. But just first, in my vulgar journalistic way, can you have a leader of the party who has applied for or has had a green card to work in America?
I don't want to make... I'm happy to discuss policy. I don't want to make personal attacks on any of the candidates. I think it is about policy. I lived in Hong Kong for 3 years. I don't think that makes me unpatriotic.
You weren't a non-dom?
I was not a non-dom. No,
Just thought I'd check.
No.
There seems to be a lot of it around. On tax policy, what interests me is this. I remember before I left the Commons being on George Osborne's front bench team. And when an election approached, the Conservative Party would usually want to cut taxes. And if it was a Labour government would want to increase spending. And you had to explain how you were going to do it. And there have been 3 different approaches already to the cornucopia of tax cuts that have been unleashed. One is, I hope I'm not misrepresenting Nadine Zahawi's position, that if you cut taxes, it will sort of pay for itself. Another view, which is in the same sort of territory, sort of, seems to be Jeremy Hunt's, and it's quite simple and elegant, is, well, we can just borrow a bit more for the time being in order to cut tax. Another approach, which has the merits of producing a plan for savings, is Sajid Javid's, where you produce a plan and it has lots of figures in it and you refer to future headroom and so on. If the plus of that is that you can find some savings, the minus of it is you get attacked immediately about your figures and your calculations. And X will say, well, he's wrong about the headcount. He's underestimating the cost. He can't do it through efficiency savings. Which approach do you think generally is one you have the most sympathy with?
Well, possibly a different approach altogether. Forecasts never turn out to be true. The ABR has never got a forecast right. That's important to bear in mind. There are some things you can cut which save you money straight away. Do we really need HS2? Is a question that all the candidates should be asking themselves. And they should not be...
You're not convinced we do?
I'm not convinced we do. I never have been, actually. I've supported it out of collective responsibility, but I've never been convinced by it. Do we need it? Don't be confused by the sunk cost fallacy. Just because we've spent some billions on it, does that really mean we want to spend another 100 billion more? You need to ask those questions. There is one big saving in the pipeline that people haven't been discussing, and that is that most figures are relative to GDP in their importance. And GDP is likely to grow in nominal terms this year regardless, because you've got 9% inflation. If you do not replicate the inflationary rise in costs and in budgets, you've suddenly got a very big potential saving in reducing government expenditure, the percentage of GDP coming through. Now, this is very difficult because you get pressures to increase on this and increase on that, and there are some things you have to do. You have to ensure that people on benefits, as I said earlier, the poor are the hardest hit by inflation, that they're able to keep up. But within other departmental budgets, you say, I'm very sorry, but you are not getting the real terms increase you thought you were getting. You are, in fact, getting a real terms cut. And that is in the pipeline because of inflation. And this is where you use the economics that you've got, however difficult, to your advantage. And so that, I think, would be the starting point. I then think...
You're basically arguing for a different form of cut in spending, the form that Sajid Javid is proposing.
It's a cut in real spending rather than nominal spending. You will not cut nominal spending when inflation is running at 9%. You just won't. It's not credible. But you can cut spending as a percentage of GDP. You can stop white elephant projects, which I think is an important thing to do. You can stop the £5 billion the Department of Transport is spending on anti-motorist policies. Let's have pro-motorist policies instead and not spend so much money on them.
Perhaps Rishi Sunak will take up the idea about increasing spending by less than inflation and say this is what he would have liked to do if only Boris Johnson wasn't so addicted to high spending.
Well, I think the idea that the Prime Minister is addicted to high spending isn't actually right, that the Chancellor has so many levers, that the Prime Minister has some things that he is very keen to do. He's very keen to ensure that levelling up took place, though that was moving money about rather than new money. He was keen to look after people hit hardest by the inflation in energy prices. He wanted to solve a multi-decade-long problem with social care. But the Chancellor always came up with higher taxes to do this rather than cutting spending in other areas. The Chancellor was the creature of the Treasury, and the Treasury is not a dynamic body. It has a Treasury orthodoxy that never sees economic growth. What we want is economic growth, and you get that by a tax regime that encourages growth.
Do you think he should just have been fired? I mean, Boris Johnson doesn't seem to have had any hesitancy about firing Michael Gove.
Well, he only fired Michael at a minute before midnight.
Do you think it was fair, though? Do you think Michael Gove is a snake?
I like Michael. I always have done. He's my most engaging company, but he thoroughly enjoys political intrigue and always has done.
Did he behave any more dishonourably last week than other ministers who also told the Prime Minister privately he should resign? Seems to Nadeem Zahawi seems to have become Chancellor one minute and then told the Prime Minister he ought to resign the next.
I think that was a mistake of Nadeem's to do that. I don't think that. By that point, it was unnecessary. Once the writing is on the wall, you need the Prophet Daniel to come and translate it rather than people to carry on writing on the wall.
You think by that point it was clear the Prime Minister was going to go?
By that point, it was inevitable. My position was I was going to support the Prime Minister, and as long as he wanted anyone to support him, I was there. Nadine and I have been arguing as to which of us is the greatest supporter. I probably have to cede first place to Nadine, but I think the Prime Minister is a great man. I think he's been a terrific leader. He has achieved extraordinary things for this country, and he has a popular touch with voters that almost nobody else has ever had. Not just of this generation. It is a unique, in our generation, touch with voters. And I've always thought the role of the candid friend is a particularly undignified one, really. So I was going to support him as long as he wanted to stay. But it was quite clear when the 5 junior ministers sent their letter in that it had gone past the point of recovery.
Are you happy with the proposed timetable for this leadership election that is being punted in advance? By the time this broadcast made, we'll be on the verge of knowing whether it'll happen, but it's the early stages of the parliamentary stage this week. Finish it off by the time of recess, new election, new leader by the time Parliament returns in September. I
think that it is unfortunate that this has the consequence of rewarding the disloyal and harming the loyal. I think that is a pity, but it is what it is.
In an ideal world, the ideal world that doesn't exist, you'd have preferred a longer contest.
Well, at least in the first stages, to allow things to settle down. I am very concerned that there is no unifying pro-Boris candidate. I don't think that's me. I'm not advertising myself for that role, but I would like us to coalesce around somebody.
Just ask a question about the culture of the parliamentary party. I mean, I remember before the last leadership election, I looked at it all and said, this could turn into the Andy Warhol leadership election with a number of people who were famous for 15 minutes. And there was quite a large field, yeah. If you go back to the one before that, in 2005, it was rather smaller, even before you got down to the final 4. I mean, this time I am losing count. I mean, we've had 19 people down on a list at one point. You have perfectly meritable backbenchers, John Barron, Raymond Kishti, Bill Wiggin, who float their names as leader. You have, as you say, a massive candidates on the centre right of the parliamentary body. What's going on?
That's what I think we could do with another week to allow things to settle down and for people to have the conversations they need to have to work out who we should coalesce around. But it is as it is. I mean, it's no good complaining about things that are.
Sounds to me as though you rather like Suella Braverman and Priti Patel and maybe Kenny Badenoch and Liz Truss to all get together in one room and not leave it until any one of them came out
not a bad idea. I mean, I happen to think so highly of all four of them. I could support any one of those with real conviction.
You're not supporting Nadeem with an M.
Oh, I think highly of him too. Of the candidate, but then I think very highly of Tom Tugendhat. I mean, I'm not going to support Tom, but I like him greatly, and he's very able.
Because he's not got the front bench experience.
I'm afraid I think he is too pro-European. I'm not convinced that he is a new minted Eurosceptic, and the problem is that the key benefit for the UK is divergence. People who have historically been wedded to the EU are not going to want to make the divergent decisions, and the administrative pressure is not to diverge.
This is very interesting because some people argue there's no problem at all about Brexit. It's done and dusted. Look, even Keir Starmer's had to come around to it, not because he likes it, but because he has to. But you're arguing that, crudely speaking, if you have the wrong people in charge, we'll have the sort of the shell of Brexit, but not the core. The core is divergence. Yeah?
I have responsibility, and will continue to have responsibility for another few weeks, for the retained EU law bill. Now, the question is, will candidates agree that retained EU law shall have a sunset in a few years' time, I hope 2026, and will they end the supremacy of EU law where it remains? Now, the Treasury was refusing to allow the end of the supremacy of EU law and of retained EU law in tax matters. So even within a government led by a staunch Eurosceptic and as me, Minister for Brexit Opportunities, we still couldn't get the Treasury to accept that it wanted to move away from the European Union. If you were to have a Prime Minister who had always liked the European Union, do you really think that he would say we must move away lock, stock and barrel from EU law? I think it's extremely unlikely. It's a lot of work to do this, a lot of administrative work and time to be taken. And you just say, oh, it's all a bit difficult. Let's just leave retained EU law, not worry about it. But it's fundamental to our statute book.
Just finally, as we go forward, this could be a very long Moggcast, but it can't be. It has to be, fitted in with reasonable time, not least yours. Are you willing to serve under another leader in government?
I'm much less ambitious than you may think. I very much doubt many people would want me to serve, so it probably won't be my choice anyway. But there are certainly people in the list who, if they got through, I would not have any desire to serve.
How many, roughly, would you serve under?
Well, I think most of the people I would be keen to serve under are unlikely to get through to the final round, let alone to win. So let me slightly demur from answering that question directly, but we'll slightly have to wait and see. But
actually, I haven't read you by the standards of politicians as a particularly ambitious one. I think when you came into the House, you might have been surprised at the news that Brexit was going to happen, and you might have been surprised to end up as leader of the Commons. So it's in that spirit I sort of want to ask you, if you are leaving, how do you feel about it? As people like to ask other people, do you feel je ne regrette rien? Are you willing to go out like Frank Sinatra singing that you did it your way?
Well, I better not sing. I think that we've discussed my singing before, and I think that for a lot of people, what I've said to officials in this department is I want to leave my current responsibilities tied up nicely in a box with a bow on it to be handed over to whoever my successor in this role happens to be, so that it's all ready to be taken on. And the backbenches are very attractive. The ability to speak more freely, to discuss ideas, as we've been doing now for some years. I mean, it was easier doing the Moggcast from the backbenches. It's easier doing it today when one isn't hemmed in by the constraints. You may not know that whilst I've been in office, 3 years I've been in office, before every Moggcast, I've had a briefing from Downing Street telling me what to say and what not to say, which I haven't necessarily been very good at following. But nonetheless, I've had this briefing. I haven't bothered with it today. I no longer need it. One can get back to discussing ideas freely and much more frankly.
There's a happy medium, which is that I think we've won more before the parliamentary recess. On the one hand, I do not expect you to be a backbencher before the parliamentary recess. On the other, you're not going to have to be looking at your briefing for that Moggcast either.
No.
So, I look forward to resuming the conversation in 2 weeks, because after all, there's so much to talk about, and the landscape by then will again have changed.
It will indeed. That is one thing that is for certain. Thank you very much.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.